Greetings. Welcome back to the third episode of Talk Tua. This will be the final episode of the school year. I want to thank all my viewers for the support, and I also want to thank my co-host Jake Baldas for our great run this year. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Today I will be discussing the mobilization of diversity in World War I. The groups that I will be discussing today are the Indians, the Aboriginals, and women. These groups had been significantly disadvantaged before the war, and they still contributed greatly to the war effort. I will begin with the Indian soldiers. Before the war, Indians were ruled by the British starting in 1858, and before that by the East India Trading Company, which was a British company. The British controlled 3/5 of the Indian territory, and the rest was split among Indian ruling territories. During British rule, living conditions, wages, health, and wealth were all decreased. The wealth of the Indian continent was significantly decreased by British policies. One of these such policies was the policy to reduce Indian manufacturing in favor of British-produced goods. They did this by placing massive tariffs on Indian textiles to make them unaffordable to the rest of the world. The result was a less wealthy continent and a country that was only producing raw goods. The British also implemented a policy called drain, which took all of India's resources by taxing the people and then using the tax money to buy all of their goods. They would then sell these goods themselves or produce other goods to strengthen their own economy. The British extorted the Indian territory for their own gains, and it significantly harmed the people of India. Concerning the rights of Indians, a law called the Defense of India was passed, which meant that it was legal to limit speech, writing, and any movement, which also gave the British the ability to imprison anyone without a trial or due process. So the British were extorting the people of India prior to World War I and limiting their rights. During World War I, King George declared war on Germany on behalf of the entire British Empire, which included India. Initially, Indians were happy to prove their loyalty in fighting in this war in hopes of eventually becoming independent. It was decided that the Indian army would serve in Europe, Egypt, East Africa, and Persia. In total, there were 683,149 Indian combat troops. Also, 563,368 non-combat soldiers served by doing unskilled labor or by doing medical tasks, among other things. These laborers built railways, produced timber, and made roads in Europe. These efforts led to an easier demobilization of the British Army. The army served on the Western Front against the Germans, and they also fought the Ottomans in Mesopotamia. The campaigns were organized into different expeditionary forces, which fought in Europe against the Ottomans in several regions. India also committed lots of resources and wealth to the war effort. Overall, the Indian war effort was massive, and it was global. Their efforts have been praised for their bravery and their big contribution to the Allies' victory. After the First World War, Indians' rights were significantly limited by the Rowlatt's Act, which limited civil liberties for Indian civilians. At the same time, reform was made to the government, allowing for a more elected officials to be in the Indian Parliament. The decision that decided this was the Government of India Act of 1919. Also, a movement of nonviolent resistance to white supremacist rule was led by Gandhi. Gandhi continued to lead effective boycotts and nonviolent movements, even though he was arrested several times. The Indian people continued to push for independence until it was given to them by the British in 1947. This independence separated the area of India into Muslim Pakistan, and the rest of India was formed into the nation of India. Moving on, I will be discussing the role of Aboriginals in World War I. Before World War I, Aboriginals were subjected to the discrimination and lack of rights comparable to that, which would be similar to that of natives in the U.S. Before the Aborigines Act of 1905, Aboriginals were given no rights, weren't considered people, couldn't vote in the army, be in the army, or have maternity pension. They weren't considered people prior to 1905. This changed, however, with the Aborigines Act of 1905 that was supposed to better protect and care for the Aboriginal people, but it instead put the government in control of these people's lives, and it also segregated them from society. This act didn't give the Aboriginal people the right to vote or other civil rights. Also, it technically wasn't legal for Aboriginals to fight in the military. The rights of Aboriginals were very limited prior to World War I and were intentionally limited by the government. During the war, around 1,000 Aboriginals served in the AIF, which was the Australian Army, basically. Many of the Aboriginal soldiers were motivated by receiving the same pay as white men in the Army, and they were treated as equals for the most part in the Army. They also fought alongside other Anzac troops during the war. During the First World War, Aboriginal soldiers fought in major fronts such as the Battle of Gallipoli. They fought in the Middle East and on the Western Front. The soldiers served with the Anzacs during the Gallipoli and in the AIF for the rest of the conflicts. In the war, they were treated as equals to other white soldiers, and they had many roles in the army, such as infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers. And they also held limited roles in the Air Force. They committed a large percentage of their population to the war effort, even though recruitment was at times limited by the AIF because of their skin color. They also served the highest percentage of any population of people in the war. After World War I, Aboriginals, some of whom fought in hopes of receiving equal treatment after World War I, came home and found out that this didn't happen. The soldiers returned home after being treated as equals in the army to being treated the same way as they were prior to the war. AIF soldiers were given land and jobs after the war as a means to repay them for their service, but Aboriginal soldiers weren't included in this program, and even some Aboriginal land was taken and redistributed to the white soldiers. Even with this, Aboriginal rights were extremely limited, and they didn't even have rights to their own children. Their rights were extremely violated in a lot of instances where Aboriginals were murdered and no justice was served. They continued to have their rights limited in Australia until 1966, when voting was extended to all Aboriginal people. They couldn't even apply for citizenship in their own country until 1944. So even after the war, their rights were limited for a long time by the government, and they didn't get them for a long time. Moving on, I will be discussing the role of women in World War I. And in this segment, I will be focusing on the contribution of British women. Prior to the First World War, women were supposed to be homemakers, and they didn't have the same rights as men. They were also employed at a much lower rate than men. Only 1 out of 10 women had jobs before the war. Possibly the most important right that women lacked before the war was the right to vote. It also wasn't proper for women to have jobs that were considered skilled labor. During the pre-war period, there was a significant demand for equality by women suffragettes who demanded voting rights for women. Before the First World War, the role of women was mostly in the home, and the rights were limited for women at the time in Britain. During the First World War, women made huge contributions to the war effort. One of their first contributions was helping the recruitment of British men to the war effort. In office positions that men left to go fight, women quickly replaced the men with 200,000 women clerks and office workers. At first, factories were reluctant to allow women to work in the factories because they didn't think that women would be able to fill these spots, and they thought it would affect the wages of men. With major shortages, though, women eventually found their place in the factories, with around 800,000 women working in munitions factories and other factories. Women also found employment in lots of other areas, such as policing, bus conductors, postal workers, farm laborers, and coal workers. In total, 1.6 million women came to the workplace during the war. Another big part of women's contributions was the Women's Land Army of Britain. There was around 260,000 women who served in this army. It never saw the front lines, but nurses and medics were stationed near the front lines. The Salvation Army also deployed lots of women, nurses, and cooks to the front line. The women of Britain kept the country running while the men were at war with Germany and Britain, and the Allies couldn't have won the war without them. After the war, most women were granted the right to vote, but it was limited to women over 30 or women 21 and older who were householders or married to a householder. This was disappointing because a lot of the women who made the biggest contributions during the war were young single laborers, so they were left out from this decision. Also, in 1918, women were given the right to run for parliament. However, when men returned from the war, their pre-war jobs and positions were returned to them, which sent women who had worked during the war home. Women who wanted to keep working or use their new skills in their careers were vilified for trying to take the jobs of former servicemen. Women were pushed back to traditional women's roles of pre-war Britain. In post-war Britain, women's education was also improved as there were more opportunities to become teachers or nurses. Women's wages eventually declined in the interwar period, and it was around half what a man's wage would be. All over, furthermore, women didn't get the right to vote. All women didn't get the right to vote until 1928. So post-World War Britain saw the introduction of more women's rights, but at the same time saw women's opportunities limited due to a push to put women back into traditional roles. Thank you for listening to the final episode of Season 1 of Talk to Us and supporting this great podcast. Have a great one.